Branch Street. Well, this is 1906. Now, the big place on the left, that was the Ryan Hotel, which was a fancy place in town. It had a bar and restaurant. Thank you very much. Now, over on the right, though, in the oval, that's today's Guitar Joe's. We just saw it on the last slide. In 1906, it's the Bank of Arroyo Grande. Farther down the street in the circle, you can see the outline of what is today Bill's Place, and then the brick storefronts just up Branch Street from there. Across the street, the other oval on the left, well, that's the Briscoe Hotel, which includes Cafe Andrini. You'll also notice on the right foreground, next to the Bank of Arroyo Grande, that's the Eagle Saloon and its patrons gossiping, I guess, outside. One of 6 saloons at the corner of Branch and Bridge Streets. We were a pretty wet town. Let's jump ahead 31 years. The first Harvest Festival. High-wheel bike hung on the side of Ira's bike shop for many years. People dressed up like it's the 1890s. And just behind this group is the Arroyo Grande Union High School Marching Band. So the high school was up on Crown Hill. They had just gotten a brand new gym that year, which is today's Paulding Gym. And those horses weren't just for recreation. Horses were part of valley agriculture until the 1940s. Now, this picture is kind of a hint as to what life was like here in the 1830s and 1840s. This is Francis Branch's Arroyo Grande. And he came here in part because of an unstable American economy. It was definitely a boom or bust economy. So Branch left the East Coast, where he was raised, and made his way west. He went with a party of mountain men and trappers led by a man named William Wolfskill. And they went over what was called the Old Spanish Trail. And that's the route there from Santa Fe to Los Angeles. And both Wolfskill and Branch would themselves become Californians once they'd made it across that forbidding desert. Branch, again, was an orphan from Scipio, New York, and that may have been part of his value as a pioneer. He learned very early on how to be self-sufficient. He'd already been through several careers. Great Lakes boat captain, mountain man, fur trapper, a grocer of all things, before he comes to the upper Arroyo Grande Valley in 1837. So he had all the qualities that make for a good pioneer. He was self-reliant. He's extremely energetic, a small, wiry man, and he was progressive looking. He was a guy who looked to the future and didn't dwell on the past. He looks a little grumpy in that picture. The other thing I like about him, though, is he allegedly had a good sense of humor, even if the joke, it said, was on him. I like that. By the way, Martin Van Buren was our president in 1837. As it notes, Queen Victoria was ascending the throne of England, which she would occupy until 1901. Just, a little mystery of history just for fun. There's Martin Van Buren as an elderly man. There were persistent rumors that he was the illegitimate son of Aaron Burr. So if you're a Hamilton fan, what do you think? So Branch, as an American, was an example of what was called manifest destiny, the idea that America was destined to spread from Atlantic to Pacific. At the time he arrived in Arroyo Grande, the United States consisted of the area in red. So He was one of those agents of pioneering, of going westward, that would ultimately fulfill the idea of manifest destiny. The, the ironic part, though, is that he did not settle Arroyo Grande as an American. In order to establish the Mexican land grant of Rancho Santa Manuela, the rancho he would name for his wife, Manuela Carlon, he had to become a Mexican citizen and become a Roman Catholic, which he did. And his land grant named for his wife 17,000 acres, and he would more than double his land holdings. By the time of his death in 1874, Branch was probably the wealthiest man in San Luis Obispo County. This photograph shows his obviously crumbling adobe home, which stood atop a hill just below what I call the new Branch School. I'm dating myself. And it's in sad shape because almost as soon as it was finished, California was hit by the Fort Tejon earthquake, a 7.9 whopper that had its epicenter in Parkfield. So that severely damaged the adobe. They would have to move to another, more modest home, while that one sadly and slowly crumbled back into the earth. Branch was primarily a cattle rancher. As many as 20,000 head grazed in Rancho Santa Manuela, but he was not one-dimensional. As we'll see, he also grew tree crops, row crops, experimented with agricultural technology, but the bulk of his fortune came from cattle ranching and from vaqueros, cowboys, like this fella. Well, this isn't one of Branch's cowboys, because this is a Dorothea Lange photograph taken on Los Osos Valley Road in 1939. But by golly, one of Branch's cowboys, vaqueros, we couldn't say vaquero, so we said buckaroo. If we look at him a little closer, he would have been instantly recognizable to a cowboy from 1837. He's got a bosal bridle, a bitless bridle, which is the one the Mexicans used. He's carrying a lariat, a rope, and he's wearing chaps. Looks like he's smoking a cigarillo, too. So this cowboy in Los Osos, near San Luis Obispo in 1939, would have fit in almost perfectly with the world of Francis Branch. And that would be Branch. And this Google Earth shot shows what he was up against. Again, Branch didn't just raise cattle. He also grew a variety of crops. But that willow scrub you see off to the right, it's called monte. It's thick and it's thorny and brambly, which is why vaqueros had to wear chaps if they were going to dive into that stuff after a stray calf. They needed the protection. Well, the Arroyo Grande Valley floor was absolutely covered with this stuff. It's estimated that as late as the 1870s, 70% of the valley was covered with monte. Branch's 20,000 cattle could graze on the hillsides, but if he was going to raise crops like this farmer, he had to clear away the monte, and that is a process that took decades and decades to accomplish. And the men who helped accomplish that, the people that Branch employed, many of them were descendants of the Chumash people who first settled the Arroyo Grande Valley. Others were mestizo, Mexican nationals who were partly Indian, partly European. And at any one time, Branch employed probably 30 to 40 people in various, everything from cooks to shoemakers to vaqueros. This is a map that shows three prominent northern Chumash villages. They were called rancherías near Arroyo Grande. The one at left bottom, Chiliquin, is just about where today's Strother Park was. And it was encountered by De Anza in his expedition, I believe it was 1769, where they met a chief there who was given his name to a street in San Luis Obispo. He had a big goiter on his neck, so they called him Buchon, Spanish for goiter, and we have a Buchon Street in San Luis Obispo today. There was a birth there in the 1770s that was significant to Arroyo Grande history and to modern anthropology. And the birth was of a Chumash woman who would have become a mission Indian, uh, overwhelmingly because of the drought which afflicted the Arroyo Grande area in the 1770s. It drove many people to the missions as a matter of survival. So they became, rather than hunter-gatherers, they became farmers. Corrales Canyon, outside of town, was known for its vineyards and its fruit orchards. And what we today call Lopez Canyon was called La Cañada de Trigo, or Wheat Canyon. So that was the breadbasket for the mission community. Of course, European encounters with Native Americans were here, as they were everywhere else in the Americas, catastrophic. Historians estimate that there were 20 million people living in the Americas in 1500, probably 2 million left alive by 1800. That's reflected in our local indigenous population. Maybe 10 to 20,000 Chumash in the area from Malibu up to the Salinas River. Only 62 identify themselves, but more accurately, the count today is 5,000 people claim that they have at least some Chumash heritage. And of course, they are thriving in places like the Santa Ynez. And one of the inheritors of the Chumash tradition, this was a photo taken in La Cañada del Trigo, Wheat Canyon, Lopez Canyon. The woman on the right was named Rosario Cooper. She was the last to speak the Obispeño dialect of Chumash. Now, there are two fellows sitting on the steps. The fellow who's higher is Rosario's husband. That's her son in the right center. Just below Rosario's husband is an anthropologist named J.P. Harrington, very famous in anthropological linguistics. Harrington made it his duty to record as many California Indian dialects as he could. As a result, in terms of anthropological linguistics, Rosario Cooper of Lopez Canyon is a celebrity. Harrington spent months and months with her as she was nearing the end of her life in 1917. And here's an example of his field notes. Rosario was also a midwife and a farmer and a mother and a great-grandmother and a great-great-great-great-grandmother, as we'll see in just a moment. Now, thanks to her, her language was preserved. And thanks to Cal Poly, her language is still being preserved.
Yak Itutio, Yak Itutio. Tzutkawayu, place of the horses, Cambria. Eloeche, named for swordfish, Paso Robles. Chilcucunich, place of the rabbits, Carrizo Plain. Tilshini, place of the full moon, cultural capital of San Luis Obispo. Tzutkawa, place of the dogs, Morro Bay. Nipumu, place of the big house, Nipomo. Tzutplatu, place of the whales, Avila.
Now, Branch had a neighbor in the Arroyo Grande Valley, more appropriately in the Wasna Valley. He was a mountain man too, and his name was George Nidever. And this Frederick Remington sketch gives you a good idea of what mountain men looked like. Both Branch and Nidever in the 1830s discovered that there were residents of the Arroyo Grande Valley that outnumbered them by far. There were hundreds of these locals, and they looked something like this. The valley was literally overrun with grizzly bears, the size of Volkswagen buses. In fact, Brent once, as a treat for his wife Manuela, went into a blackberry thicket. He was going to pick her a bucket of blackberries, made a prompt U-turn because 7 grizzly bears had beaten him to the fruit. As late as the 1870s, Branch's son Ramon went with friends for a 15-mile ride in the Wasna Valley. And in that 15 miles, they sighted no less than 22 grizzly bears. Of course, they were promptly wiped out, more or less, and we have them today only on our state flag. Incidentally, Nidever, who was Branch's neighbor in the Wasna Valley, would become involved with another California tragedy, and that would be the rescue, and that's in quotes for good reason, of Juana Maria, a woman who was living alone on San Nicolas Island. When Nidever brought her ashore for some human companionship, she promptly died. She lives on, though, in the award-winning juvenile novel, Island of the Blue Dolphins. Juana Maria, the man that Branch's neighbor found, was the model for the protagonist in Scott Odell's novel. Now, Nidever wouldn't be a rancher for long. He gave up after 1 year, and he had killed his 200th grizzly bear. He'd had it. So Nidever was succeeded by this man. This is Isaac Sparks. And you notice Isaac has one eye slightly askew. You know, Isaac had been a mountain man too before he became a rancher in the Wasna Valley. And that slightly askew eye, you guessed it, is due to a grizzly bear. So Sparks would take over the 22,000-acre Rancho Wasna. Now, what's fascinating to me is that this ranch is still in Isaac Sparks' family today. It's the modern Porter Ranch. Here it is at roundup time, still in business. And I'm happy to say that the man who runs the ranch today was my high school debate partner, John Porter, a wonderful man. So Sparks, an Easterner, was one of what I call the Big Four in the South County. John Michael Price, who actually was English, the owner of Rancho Pismo. Of course, William Dana, the master of Rancho Napomo, who was a New Englander, and a ship captain, and Francis Branch from, of all places, Scipio, New York. These ranchers had ties to the early American Industrial Revolution, and the agent that linked Arroyo Grande, California, and, say, New England were ships like this Yankee brig. Now, this is a replica of the Pilgrim, and this is the ship that Richard Henry Dana came with into California, and on which the nonfiction book 2 Years Before the Mast is based. Sadly, Dana came close to meeting, but never did meet, his fourth cousin, William Dana, at Rancho Napomo. What strikes me about Rancho Napomo, and Rancho Santa Manuela for that matter, is how incredibly self-sufficient these rancheros were. For example, the Dana adobe, which is in one of the most beautiful spots in San Luis Obispo County, not a single nail was used in its construction. And cattle were used to the utmost. The place was tied together with rawhide thongs. The Rancho Napomo, they made their own clothing and dye for the clothing. They had a shoemaker on the premises. They had wine grapes, and Juan Francisco Dana records that his father even distilled a little whiskey for medicinal purposes. I've always loved the steeple on the Dana adobe, and one of Mr. Dana's daughters, she would climb up to the steeple in the morning, and she would point to the horse she wanted to ride that day, and one of the Dana vaqueros would rope the horse and bring it up to the adobe for the little girl to ride. Rancheros weren't completely self-sufficient. Things like fine china, cigars, and cloth had to come from the East Coast, courtesy of those Yankee brigs. Branch's most esteemed purchase from New England was his own personal corn sheller. So while the rancheros' products went to the east, it was finished goods that came to California's west coast. And the raw material was cattle. Surprisingly, Rancho Santa Manuela's 20,000 head weren't valued for their meat, but for their tallow from which candles were made, and even more for New England shoe factories for their leather. So shoe factories and cotton mills were the beginnings of the American Industrial Revolution. Cotton mills in places like Lowell, Massachusetts, shoe factories in places like this one, Raleigh, Massachusetts, or in Boston. So at slaughtering time in June, the hides would be stripped from the animal, and then they would be fastened by pegs to the ground. And seawater would be poured over them repeatedly, then they'd be allowed to dry until they were just about as stiff as plywood. And in that picture on the right, you see a seaman carrying those California dollars, is what they were called. They were so valuable to the shoe factories. Carrying them out to a longboat, which will in turn transport them to New England via a Yankee brig. You would have seen something like this at Cave Landing, today's Pirates Cove, where brigs made their calls, and where somehow, if you've ever seen the millstone, the branch millstone, which is in Heritage Square in Arroyo Grande, with which branch ground wheat into flour, somehow they brought that up the cliffs of Cave Landing and inland to Rancho Santa Manuela. I don't know how, but it was an incredible feat. Now, trade was one tie between California and East Coast, but these New England ship captains seemed to have a habit of falling in love with one young California woman. And many intermarriages, Harlow, for example, Sparks, of course, Branch married Manuela Carlon. His best friend, John Michael Price of Rancho Pismo, married Maria Carlon. The Carrillo sisters were prized brides. Maria Josefa Carrillo married William Dana, and then Maria Ramona Carrillo de Pacheco would, from another branch of the Carrillo family, would marry John Wilson, the master of Rancho Pecho y Los Osos y Isle, which occupied a good part of the north coast. So that was the other tie between the American East and the Mexican West. And even puritanical, and believe me, he was, a young Harvard student, Richard Henry Dana, was charmed by California women. Here he is looking suitably grumpy. I'm sorry to say that he married a woman who looked even grumpier, and they lived the rest of their puritanical lives together. But he was charmed when he went to a wedding in Santa Barbara between, you guessed it, a ship captain and a young California woman. And they loved to dance. So you see an example of that here. What struck Dana was a young woman announced her intentions to dance by sneaking up behind her future dance partner and smushing an egg full of perfume on top of his head. They're called cascarones. And for some reason, that just tickled Dana. He thought that was pretty amazing. In fact, California women were considerably more powerful than their Yankee counterparts. And that's largely because of Mexican property laws. So women could inherit property, unlike, say, women on the East Coast who had the same rights as children and illegally insane. Branch was a progressive thinker, too. He educated his daughters alongside his sons in what would have been Arroyo Grande's first schools. In researching this and finding this out, I was suddenly struck by a certain movie scene that never would have happened with, say, Mrs. Branch or Mrs. Dana or Mrs. Price. And that, of course, is it's tempting to romanticize ranchero life. In fact, some of it was romantic. They did love to dance. These people worked hard, but they loved to play too. Barbecues and dances. Christmas was a huge occasion. And their ability to have fun bothered Richard Henry Dana. The flip side of that is life was very hard. Life here was definitely frontier life. We were on the American frontier. And in 1862, that is something that definitely entered Francis Branch's life. Their neighbors, the Danas. Mrs. Dana gave birth to 21 children. She tied a record held by Mrs. Johann Sebastian Bach, but 11 of them died before they reached adulthood. Manuela Carlon, Branch's wife at the lower right, her sister Maria was married to John Michael Price. She gave birth to 11 children. Only 3 of them outlived her. This is the Branch family burying ground. That's Mr. Branch's tombstone. He died in 1874. There are 3 little tombstones alongside his. That probably is because this represents the central tragedy of his life. In 1862, he was away on business in San Francisco. Mrs. Branch put up a traveler for the night, as was the custom in California. He moved on the next day and he left smallpox behind. Branch got word in San Francisco that his daughters had come down with smallpox. He rode as hard as he could back to Rancho Santa Manuela. And by the time he got there, 2 of his little girls were dead, and a 3rd died soon after. And I know how this affected him because his daughters are buried right next to their father. He missed them. I think maybe this should be called Our Own Wild West Part 1, because we're going to see some more of that in a future class. But the character in the center there, that's a Colt Dragoon revolver in his holster, is Captain Harry Love, and those are members of his posse, the so-called California Rangers. They were charged with hunting down, apprehending, and or killing the outlaw Joaquin Murrieta, who in fact may have been as many as 7 different Joaquins. They allegedly did so. They shot the man to death near Coalinga in 1853, not long after it said that Joaquin and his bandidos had spent the night in the Mission Gardens in San Luis Obispo. Well, there was a $5,000 reward, and Coalinga is hot in the summer when the killing took place. So to demonstrate they had done their duty, the Harry Love and the California Rangers cut off Joaquin's head and put it in a big jar of preservative, took it back to Sacramento to show it off and collect their reward. It became a great attraction up and down California until, sadly, or maybe appropriately, it disappeared in the 1906 San Francisco earthquake. Well, we began to have even closer ties with the United States of America thanks to the Mexican-American War, and this character, this John Charles Fremont, an explorer called the Pathfinder, then a major in the American Army, who came through San Luis Obispo County in December of 1846 at the head of about 400 horsemen, the so-called California Battalion, made up of everything from Bear Flag revolters to Army engineers to Walla Walla Indians. Their war paint was running because that was one rainy December. They stopped in San Luis Obispo, caused quite a ruckus, mounted a cannon on Churro Street, arrested some suspected Mexican sympathizers whom they threatened to shoot. They were persuaded not to, and they rode on to Arroyo Grande, and they camped on the creek near what is today the mayor's house on Myrtle Avenue. And they needed fresh horses, so they rode on to Rancho Nipomo, where Fremont dickered with Mr. Dana, charmed Mrs. Dana, bounced little Juan Francisco Dana on his knee, and they agreed that Fremont's party could have some horses, also some beef cows, because it said that California ate no less than 10 pounds of beef per man per day. I have 2 large sons, and not even they can meet that quota. So Fremont got his horses. He picked out the best ones that Mr. Dana had and headed south with them to Mr. Foxton's rancho. Dana got even. He sent a vaquero and the Rancho Nipomo bell mare down to the Foxton's rancho, and the horses that Fremont had, quote unquote, borrowed simply followed the bell mare back to Rancho Nipomo. Now, either because of the Foxton's advice or because of his own intuition, Fremont was on his way to capture Santa Barbara, which would be successful. He was going to head through the Gaviota Pass, which even today looks like a prime ambush spot to me. Every time I drive through it, I think about that. Fremont decided to take the San Marcos Pass instead, and the result was the surrender of Santa Barbara, later of the Presidio of Los Angeles, and the Treaty of Cahuenga, which ended the Mexican War in California. So the outcome of that war would be manifest destiny would be accomplished with the immense Mexican cession, about a third of Mexico's original national territory. Now, from 1848, the war's end, until statehood in 1850, California would be ruled by a succession of military governors, Stephen Kearny and Richard Mason, for whom a street in San Francisco is named. Doesn't look too happy, but he was the military governor of California. And then, of course, everything changed. The rancheros eventually became American citizens. They could either do so voluntarily, or they automatically became American citizens within a year of statehood. So now Branch, the American, then the Mexican, was now an American again. The other thing that changed was the gold rush, 1848, of course, at Sutter's Mill. This cartoon illustrates Americans getting to the gold fields by any way they can, including fanciful balloons and rockets. The poster advertises the route through Nicaragua, where they would change ships, walk across Nicaragua to the Pacific side, board another ship, provided they survived Nicaragua, which was notorious for malaria. The other choice was to sail around Cape Horn, which was hazardous. But I love this picture, which is, we'll see another one similar to, a little bit closer. These are ships abandoned in San Francisco Harbor during the gold rush. 300,000 people came to California between 1848 and 1852. It's one of the great internal migrations of American history. They weren't just Americans. Many of them were Chilenos from Chile. Many were Australians. Some were French. And of course, we had a large number of gold miners who came from China. This was a new opportunity for men like Branch and Price. The money, they realized, as Levi Strauss did, wasn't to be made in mining gold. That was for suckers. The money was to be made in providing for the needs of the gold miners. And now cattle became valuable as a food source. Also, again, brought opportunities for sailors to, say, jump ship to go to the gold fields. The restaurant in the Jackson Square part of San Francisco, that's kind of based on this habit. Here's some more abandoned ships, and it's appropriately called the Old Ship Restaurant. You can see the Transamerica Pyramid from the window. There's the longboat that has an appropriate sign. Well, by golly, in 2007, I think, in a lot next to the old ship, they found the old ship. One of many sailing ships that had been abandoned that were used as fill as the city of San Francisco expanded into the bay. Now, the Arkansas was not filled with gold miners. It was filled with Methodist missionaries from the East Coast, determined to convert the gold fields, which were rife with heathens. Unfortunately, Arkansas ran aground and became a saloon, and then a brothel, and then a saloon. And today, just above it, it's a saloon again. And it was 3 ship jumpers from San Francisco Bay, U.S. Navy sailors, were among a group of 6 men who carried out the first mass murder in California history at Mission San Miguel. And it was connected to gold. A young man named William Reed and his family lived there. They kept an inn, and a restaurant in the mission buildings. He had just sold 300 head of sheep to gold miners for food, and brought home a sack of gold dust so heavy he said that his 3-year-old boy couldn't lift it. Well, the Navy deserters and their companions who overheard this couldn't resist, so they stayed overnight, started to leave the next morning, and then came back, murdered Reed and his family and his servants, 11 people in all. It was horrific. And the person who first found the murder victims was this man, a mountain man named Medicine Jim Beckworth, pretty famous mountain man. Beckworth had a talent for finding dead people. He found the 11 victims of the San Miguel Mission massacre stacked in the carpenter's shop. Now, he'd also found the body of mountain man Jedediah Smith, who'd been killed by the Sioux. And if you've seen the film The Revenant, he found the body of the mountain man Hugh Glass, who'd been killed by the Araucari. So I have an operating theory that if you see Medicine Jim Beckworth riding up your driveway, that's not a good sign. Well, in December of 1848, he was a mail carrier, and the mail had come from Los Angeles to its drop-off point at Rancho Napomo. Beckworth's job was to carry it north to the Presidio at Monterey, and one of his stopping places on the way was Mission San Miguel, where, horrified, he discovered the murder victims. Rode as hard as he could north to the Presidio and reported the murders to no less than a young lieutenant named William Tecumseh Sherman. Sherman's commander, Kearny, immediately sent a party of soldiers south to look for the killers. The next night, John Price and his friend Francis Branch had been in the gold fields just for a kind of look around, and they were riding back home when they were the second to discover the murder victims. Price said later that he didn't sleep for 3 nights. They sent a young man named Estrada, the son of the founders of Atascadero, riding hard to the south to warn their friend William Dana at Rancho Napomo that the killers might be headed his way. Now, the note that John Price wrote to Dana is still in the Santa Barbara Mission Archives, and I was delighted to find out that it was written in, I guess, what you would call Spanglish, a mixture of Spanish and English. In the middle of the English sentence, Price warned Dana to look out for a güero, a blondie, who was headed south. Well, Price sent a posse after them too, so now there were 2 groups chasing the killers. Eventually, it was a 3rd posse out of Santa Barbara that intercepted them near Summerland. There was a gunfight on the beach. One of the killers was in turn killed. One of the posse members was shot to death. Another killer attempted to swim to Japan and did not make it. He too was shot to death. The remaining 3 were brought back to Santa Barbara and tried before a group of citizens at an inquest, and 3 of the surviving outlaws were taken back to Santa Barbara, tried before a citizens panel, and executed by a United States Army firing squad, and executed somewhere near this Bank of America and California Pizza Kitchen for future reference. The commander of that firing squad was a young artillery lieutenant who would also become a Civil War general like Sherman. This is Edward O.C. Ord, who would become a general in the closing campaign that would lead to Lee's surrender at Appomattox in 1865. And of course, Fort Ord was named for him. So it would develop throughout the 1850s that what was called El Camino Real, what we call Highway 101, was a dangerous place. David Newsom, who was the son-in-law of Mr. Branch, was riding south with a state assembly candidate on a campaign, and about as often as you see Buellton pea soup signs, The campaigner would point out to Newsom where the skeletal remains of some robbery victim had been found the year before. Well, this gang was accused of leaving some of those skeletons that David Newsom and his companion had found between San Luis Obispo and Santa Barbara. Their motto, it said, is "Dead men tell no tales." So robbery was their motive, but they didn't want to leave any witnesses behind. Finally, in a quick succession, there were 5 murders north of the grade in San Luis Obispo. That was it. They had gone too far. This marvelous photograph of the Mission Square, and there's San Luis Mountain again in the background. French hotel where a young Chinese man named Louis got his start as a cook. If you look just to the right of the Mission, that building's La Casa Grande. That was built by William Dana, and that was kind of a meeting hall, gathering place, and it was also an armory. Whenever outlaws were rumored to be in the area, especially Joaquin Murrieta, the locals would gather at La Casa Grande, arm themselves, and set off in hot pursuit or other. Now, the result, though, of these killings in 1858 was the spearheading by Walter Murray, who had actually been in Stevenson's regiment with Jack Powers, the spearheading of the Vigilance Committee of 1858, modeled on San Francisco's more famous Vigilance Committee of 1856. And among those who at least supported the Vigilance Committee financially was Francis Branch. $300 was a considerable amount of money in those days. Murray's motivations, in my opinion, had to do with the fact that he had just married a Chileña, a woman from Chile, a widow, and brought her to San Luis Obispo and started a family. He's obviously, in this photo, a doting father with his little girl, and he died rather young. This is his tombstone, which indicates he was also a loving husband. The inscription reads, "Farewell," and it's a man's hand and a woman's clasped together. So it's my hunch that this young lawyer and the founder of the San Luis Tribune wanted to tame wild San Luis Obispo. So they went after Pio Linares. They found him in the Los Osos Valley. And there was a 2-day running gun battle. One of the Vigilance Committee members was shot to death, but so was Pio Linares. 2 suspected accomplices were brought back to San Luis Obispo. They were given quick trials, and one of the judges on the panel of the Vigilance Committee was John Michael Price, and they were hanged outside the Mission. At least 6 hangings that we know of. There were others before this time, and there's a suspicion that at least one of the victims of the Vigilance Committee was innocent. This was all done during the summer of 1858. Jack Powers fled California and would eventually be killed in an argument over a woman in Mexico. Now, 4 years later, in addition to losing his little girls, another drought hit California, as it had in the 1770s, which forced the missionization of the Chumash. At its height, Rancho Santa Manuela had supported 20,000 head of cattle. Nearly all of them died in 1862-63. Branch lost the modern equivalent of $8 million. Despite that, he was kind of starting over again in 1862. Again, he was diversified. He grew a variety of crops as well, and he even laid out the plan for a town that would be called Arroyo Grande. Here's a photo of it in the early 1900s. After his death in 1874, the sons would build Manuela a beautiful little redwood house below the old adobe, which was kind of beginning to fade away. Sadly, that house burned down in 1959. I remember that night distinctly. So the main house would melt into the ground, as would the outbuildings. But if you are near or in between the new branch school and the old branch school, uh, you see a stand of palm trees. And that's just about where Manuela's redwood frame house stood. And above it, at the crest of the hill with a good view of the valley, that's where the adobe stood. There are other remnants too. The Tally Vineyards tasting room was the adobe called the Rincon adobe of Branch's eldest son, Ramon. In the upper right, there's the Branch Millstone. It's where we get the name Branch Mill Road, because Mr. Branch uh, ground the flour that Valley farmers produced. And of course, lower right is where I began my education. That's the old 1880s branch school. Of course, the biggest thing that he left behind is our town.